Boldwood presents A Home Full of Hope, written by Fenella J Miller and read by Candida Gubbins. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Chelmsford, August 1848. "Ma, Jimmy's eating dirt again," Tommy yelled from the garden. Alfie had been feeding the chickens and was supposedly keeping an eye on his youngest son. He loved both of them, but it weren't enough to keep him content. Betty was blooming and had made several suggestions about him moving back into the marital bed. He didn't want no more kids. 2 were enough for him. "Shut it, Tommy. Your ma's out at the market." He rescued the infant and scooped the mud from his mouth. "It ain't good for you, little man. Why don't you play with them bricks instead? Tommy, you're supposed to be playing with your brother." His oldest, now close to 3 years of age, scowled at him. "I want to go with Joe, Davy and John. I don't like it here with you." "You ain't old enough to go out with your cousins. Little Mary's satisfied with staying here and she's older than you." The baby wriggled to be put down, and he was happy to oblige. It was stupid arguing with the kiddie. In fact, his whole life was stupid. He had no place in this household, although his ma, wife and sister did their best to make him feel important. Betty took care of the house. She had 2 skivvies to help her. His sister Sarah ran the clothes business and did the cutting and designing, whilst Ma oversaw the sewing and sale of the garments. He flexed his damaged hand. If that bastard Hatch hadn't got his men to bust it, he would still be making decent furniture, have his own business, not be kept by the women folk. His only solace was his dog, Buster, and he wasn't looking too clever lately. He thought his huge friend felt as trapped as he did, living in the centre of Chelmsford and away from the countryside they both loved. "Pa, Jimmy stinks." This was one job Alfie refused to do. Changing shit-filled rags was a woman's job. "Right, you watch him, I'll fetch your Auntie Sarah." He didn't like to go inside the pristine back hallway without taking off his boots, so he yelled through the open door. "Sarah, Jimmy needs changing." She appeared from the office. "You'll have to bring him to the door. I'm not going out in my indoor shoes." Reluctantly, he picked up the smelly baby and, holding him at arm's length, carried him to the back door. "I'm taking the dogs for a walk. Tommy can come with me." Her smile faded. She was looking over his shoulder, and he turned with a dreadful sinking feeling in his guts. Buster was stretched out by the back gate, and Buster's son, Spot, was standing over him, whining. He ran to the animal's side and dropped to his knees. Buster opened an eye, licked his hand, thumped his tail once, and with a sigh, he was gone. Spot began to howl, an unearthly, hideous noise that brought the 5 seamstresses, skivvies, his ma and sister to the garden. Alfie let the tears trickle unheeded down his cheeks. He'd just lost the most important friend in his life. Buster had been with him for 7 years. He was the reason he was still living in Chelmsford. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. "I'm so sorry, Alfie. I know he meant the world to you, but he was old. It was his time to go. We all knew that." He scrambled to his feet. "I need to bury him, but not here. We both hate it here. I'll take him to the river and bury him there." "You can't carry him. He's a dead weight. You'll never be able to pick him up. I'll send one of the girls for the carter, shall I?" "I'll fetch him myself. I ain't completely useless. I'll cover him. I don't want the children upset." She leant past him and gently draped an old tablecloth over his friend. Spot had stopped howling and pressed himself against his leg. I know. It won't be the same now he's gone. He went through the house, tramping mud down the freshly scrubbed flagstones, and stormed out of the front door, slamming it behind him. It were market day, so he'd find a lad with a barrow easy enough. He hoped he didn't bump into his wife. She was the last person he wanted to share his grief with. Although the square was busy, he soon found what he needed. "You two want to earn a bob for an hour's work?" "Yeah, mister, too right," the larger of the lads said eagerly. "Bring your barrow, follow me." Alfie didn't explain why he needed them. He was too choked to talk about it even to strangers. The garden was silent, no sign of his children. Spot was also absent, no longer guarding his dead father. "We'll have to lift him on the cloth. It'll take all three of us." "Blimey, mister, he ain't half big. Where are we taking him?" Again, it was the larger of the two boys who spoke. "Along the river. He liked it down there." Even with help, it was bloody difficult getting the dead weight onto the barrow, but eventually they managed it. He left them to push and strode ahead with a shovel on his shoulder. He stopped where the river curved, where it were quiet and Buster could rest in peace. "Just put him there, then you two can bugger off." He tossed them a coin each, and they seemed satisfied with the exchange. He waited until he was alone before beginning to dig the hole in the bank. It had to be high up, as the river flooded, and he didn't want his dog's remains washed into the water. First, he carefully cut away the grass and rolled it up so he could replace it after Buster was buried. It were going to take a bleeding big hole. He'd been digging for an hour when footsteps approached. He didn't look round, hoped whoever it was would have the common courtesy to walk past without comment. A hand dropped on his shoulder. "Right sorry about Buster, Uncle Alfie. We're here to help," Joe, his oldest nephew, said from behind him. "Thanks, lads. Appreciate it." With all four of them digging, the grave was completed in another hour, and they reverently rolled Buster's remains into the hole. Then they backfilled and replaced the top grass. "I don't reckon anyone would know he was there, Uncle Alfie," Davy said. "Spot wouldn't come with us. He's hiding in the pantry," John added. Alfie brushed the worst of the mud from his trousers, cleaned the shovel on the grass, and was ready to go. He'd not come down here again, not ever. He'd said his goodbyes. "You better get back. Your ma will have tea on the table." "Aren't you coming, Uncle?" "No, Joe, I need to be on my own. Tell your Auntie Betty not to wait up for me." The three boys huddled together, staring at him as if he were a stranger. He put his arms around them. It weren't their fault Buster had kicked the bucket. They had loved him as much as he had, and must be as devastated as he was. "He meant a lot to me, boys. He saved my life 12 times. I don't know how I'm going to manage without him." John, the youngest at 8 years of age, sniffed and wiped his snotty nose on his sleeve. "We've still got Spot. You ain't got no one now. Don't be daft, John. Uncle Alfie's got all of us, and he can share Spot, can't he?" "Joe's right. I'm not thinking straight. You run along. I'll see you later. I thank you for your help." Alfie's voice was gruff. He turned his back on them and strode away, not wanting them to see him cry. Sarah heard the door slam and swallowed the lump in her throat. Her brother would take this loss badly. Indeed, they all would. No, that wasn't quite true, as Betty had never taken to Buster. Tommy was crying and Jimmy struggling to get down. "No, I need to change your backside. Tommy, go and find Mary. She's helping your grandma in the shop." The little boy ran off, his tears forgotten, as he wasn't allowed out there. He usually knocked things over if not watched every second. The maids were still snivelling. "Get about your work, you two. No excuse for standing about." They scuttled off, leaving her with the unpleasant task of a very smelly baby to deal with. Her mother brought both children into the back parlour, the one they used for every day. "I've just heard about the dog. Alfie's already unsettled. Losing his best friend might be the last straw. He and Betty don't get along too well. He's fond of his boys, but I don't think that's enough to keep him here. I think he might well leave now Buster is gone. He doesn't like the fact that we bring in the money with our business. You'd think that he'd be happy to swagger about in smart clothes with nothing to do all day. Most men would be. Alfie's not like most men. He's always looked after himself and his family. It sits hard with him that he can't make his cabinets any more. He's never loved Betty, not really. He wouldn't have married her if she hadn't been in the family way. He offered to invest his own money in my business, but I told him to keep it." Sarah stared at her mother. "I didn't know that. Small wonder he's not happy with the situation. Why wouldn't you let him put money in?" Her mother pulled a face. "He didn't make that money honestly. I don't want it anywhere near my business." This was the second time Ma had called it her business. Sarah thought it was a joint enterprise. After all, without her design skills and financial acumen, the shop wouldn't have become as lucrative as it was. "Too late to repine. The damage has been done. If Alfie leaves, it will be your fault." "It wouldn't make any difference if he did go. He's just another mouth to feed, and he doesn't bring in any money of his own. Why doesn't he make the things that he can? Those baby chairs, beds and such would sell." This conversation was going badly. It was as if she didn't know her mother, yet she had been working closely with her for the past 2 years, building up the ladies' and children's ready-made clothing business. Ma owned the lease for the premises, but before Sarah had joined her, she'd only been making a fraction of what they were now. "He hasn't got a workshop. He had to leave his tools behind, and when he asked if he could build something in the garden, you refused to let him. There's barely enough room out there for the children to play, to hang out the laundry and such. I don't want a blooming great shed taking up half the space." "In which case, why are you complaining he hasn't been doing any carpentry? He tried to find himself premises close by, but the only place that was suitable was the other side of Chelmsford, and Betty kicked up a fuss when he suggested they moved there. I went to see the house myself, and it was perfect." "That girl knows which side her bread is buttered, Sarah. She wouldn't have servants to do her bidding anywhere else." The front door opened and closed. Betty came in, and her happy smile slipped. The maid, carrying 2 laden baskets, staggered past and on into the kitchen. "Why the gloomy faces?" "Buster died. Alfie's taking it hard." "He thought more of that animal than he does of his wife and children. Maybe now he'll consider being a proper husband to me." "Betty, how can you be so callous? Buster was with him for years. He had a bond with that dog that was quite remarkable. If you don't want to lose him altogether, you'd better change your attitude. He needs our support and sympathy." Her comment struck home. "You can't mean that, Sarah. Surely he wouldn't abandon his family because his dog has died." She glanced at her mother. "Ma refused to let him be part of this business. You refused to move when he found somewhere suitable to work. He doesn't have a place here. He needs to earn his own living and not be dependent on us. I don't know why you don't understand this." Her mother finally took notice. "If I'd known how badly he took it, I would never have refused him. You tell him he can put his money into this business, and I'll put his name on the deeds." "It might be too late for that. He's had the past 2 years to stew about things. He told me last month that he was thinking of going to London to look for his old friend and maybe go into business with him." Betty burst into noisy tears. "Don't let him go, Sarah. Tell him I'll move wherever he wants as long as he stays." "Why are you asking me to do this? Betty, he's your husband. Ma, he's your son. I can't put matters right for you. This is something you have to do yourselves. I've got to get back to the shop, Sarah. I heard the bell go 3 times. I'll speak to him when he gets back from burying that dog. Her mother rushed off, leaving her with her sister-in-law, who was still sniffing loudly. The boys will be back from school soon. They're going to be desperately sad. Won't you speak to Alfie for me? Tell him what a good wife I am, that I love him, that he has a duty to stay with us. No, that's something you must do yourself. I'll leave you to take care of the children. I've got business to attend to. Once in the sanctuary of her office, she had time to think about the consequences of what had happened this morning. She should have spoken to Betty and her mother months ago. Then maybe things would not be as parlous as they were. She feared whatever anyone said to her brother, it was too late and he would depart. Last time he had gone to London, he had been sold as a slave to a lighterman, had eventually escaped with Buster, and lived a life of crime on the streets until he had made enough to set himself up in a small business delivering items on barrows. When he'd returned to Colchester, he had been a man of means, although not yet 16 years of age. If Dan, her beloved husband, hadn't been killed in a tragic accident, none of this would have happened. Although 2 years had passed since her man had died, she still missed him dreadfully, especially as every time his son Joe stepped into the room, she was reminded of him. Her eldest stepson was now, at 12, almost a man, his shoulders beginning to widen, his voice to deepen, and he was now as tall as she was. Davy, a year younger, took after his dead ma, was slight of build and fairer of colouring. John, now 8, was like neither of them. His hair was a sandy colour and his eyes were green. However, there was no mistaking that they were siblings. The daughter she'd had with Dan looked like her, apart from the fact that her hair was more black than brown. Now she was almost 3 years old, as bright as a button, and a constant delight. Living in a house full of boys, she was petted and fussed, but miraculously had remained unspoiled by all this attention. Whatever Betty and her ma thought, she believed Alfie should go to London. It would be better if he departed with everyone's blessing, as that way he was more likely to stay in touch. If he left in high dudgeon, he might not come back, and that she couldn't bear. She kept watch for her boys, and was on her feet to greet them as soon as they opened the back gate. They were joshing and laughing as they crossed the garden. She hated to be the one to spoil their good mood. "Boys, Buster died this morning. Your uncle is burying him somewhere along the riverbank." "We were talking about that yesterday. We knew he didn't have long. I reckon Uncle Alfie will be knocked sideways. Come along, you two. Grab some spades. We'll go and find him. Give him a hand." "Where's Spot? We'll take him with us." "I don't know, Davy. He's hiding somewhere. I should try the scullery." He hurried off whilst his brothers were collecting the tools they needed to help dig the hole. He returned shaking his head. "He won't come. We'll have to go without him." "Boys, don't be surprised if your uncle is a bit brusque with you. He'll appreciate you being there even if he doesn't say so." They exchanged glances and nodded. "We ain't stupid, Ma. We know how much Buster meant to him. We loved him too, but it ain't the same for us." Joe smiled sadly and led the 2 younger boys out of the gate without a further word. She was proud of her boys. They were getting a good education, and when Joe left school this summer, he was hoping to sign up as a cabin boy. Robert Billings, a good friend of her brother's and of hers, was a first mate and had already passed his captain's ticket. He'd promised to find Joe a place on his vessel. She would have to be blind not to know that Robert was in love with her. He never said or did anything to cause her offence when he visited, but just knowing when she was ready he was there gave her hope for the future. Chapter 2. Alfie wanted to drown his sorrows, but couldn't face going into an alehouse when he was so distressed. He needed to go somewhere quiet where he could think. He'd buy himself a pasty and a coffee, then come back here. There was always a coffee stall in the market, and more than one place he could find himself a decent pie. He had lived in Chelmsford for almost 2 years, but hadn't made any friends. His mate Robert caught the train from Colchester whenever he had shore leave, but he'd not been around for the last year, and he'd missed him. He thought his friend was sweet on his sister, and they'd make a good match, but he didn't reckon Sarah was ready to move on from Dan just yet. Once he'd got his grub, he headed for the river again, but the opposite bank to the one upon which he'd just buried his best friend. There was nothing to keep him here now. Betty was well provided for, and so were his sons. Sarah didn't need him. Her business was thriving, and she was putting large sums of money every week into a bank account. When he'd been living in London a few years back, he'd made a good friend, apart from Jimmy, who died, one George Benson. It were he who taught him carpentry. He hadn't seen him for years, had not been back to the city, but he would go now and search out George and see if he couldn't invest in his business. He wouldn't return until he had made something of himself, could hold his head up, provide for his wife and family himself. He'd speak to Sarah first. She was the only one who understood him. He still had his money in the bank. He'd get it transferred to a London branch. He wasn't stupid enough to carry it in his pocket, like what he had all those years ago. Decision made, he returned to the house that had never been his home, the place where he'd always felt like an intruder, an unwanted lodger. He didn't object to women earning their own keep, running a business, but it were a man's job to provide, and nobody could tell him otherwise. He hesitated at the back gate, knowing the pain would strike him like a knife when he opened it. His beloved Buster had died there, and he would have to walk past the place he'd drawn his last breath. Too late to walk around to the front, he might as well go in. There were too many bad memories here now. The sooner he left, the happier he'd be. His sister was waiting for him in the passageway and beckoned him into her office where they wouldn't be disturbed. The children knew better than to go in there unless invited. He could hear the murmur of voices coming from the parlour. Nobody but him seemed to have been adversely affected by this loss. "You've decided to go, haven't you, Alfie?" His sister had always understood him best. "I have. I'm not going to sneak off like a thief in the night. I'll speak to Betty and Ma, but I'm off tomorrow. I've got to visit the bank, but after that I'm catching the next train to London." "Promise me you'll keep in touch? I know why you've got to do this. I don't think you're right, but I do understand. As long as you let us know where you are, then I expect we can manage without you for a while." "I'm not coming back until I've made something of myself. I'm sick of being looked down on, laughed at. I need to be able to hold my head up." "There's no need to exaggerate, Alfie. Nobody looks down on you or laughs at you. It's in your own imagination. At least be honest with yourself about the reasons you're going." His cheeks flushed, and he ran a finger around his collar. "I ain't happy with Betty. I should never have married her, let alone had 2 kids. I'm no good as a father or husband. They'll be better off without me. I only stayed for you and Buster." "Not for our mother?" "She ain't what you think she is, Sarah. You want to watch her. Put some money in your own name so that it ain't all in hers. You're doing the hard work. Make sure you have something put by, just in case." "I think you could be right, but I hope not. The children love her, and she has treated Dan's boys as if they were her own grandchildren. That said, in future I will put half the money in my name." "Do that, Sarah, love. You don't want to end up with nothing after all the hard work you've put in over the past 2 years. I've always thought she could have made more of an effort to find us if she'd really wanted to. That's water under the bridge. But I never want to be in the same situation I was when Dan died. I've got 4 dependents to consider now. What do you think will happen to Betty and your sons if our mother abandons us again? I don't expect you to provide for my family. I won't be living here, but I'll send funds for them as soon as I'm set up. It ain't that far. I can be back in a couple of hours. That's all right then. Explain to Betty that you intend to come back. She'll not be happy, but she'll accept it as long as she knows you'll be home one day. Come for your boys' birthdays. For Christmas, perhaps. As you say, it's only an hour or so on the train. I can do that. I ain't exactly running away, just going off to make something of myself. I ain't comfortable being supported by you and Ma. As always, talking things through with his sister made it clearer in his head. She didn't judge him, nag him, make him feel inferior like what Betty and his Ma did. Until she'd mentioned it, he hadn't thought about coming back to see everyone until he was financially secure again. I'm transferring half my money to London, but I'll put the rest in your account to take care of Betty and the boys if need be. Don't tell her, she'll fritter it away knowing her. I take it you have one. I certainly do. I've been putting £1 or 2 away each week for a rainy day. She wrote the numbers on a slip of paper and handed it to him. As soon as you've settled, send us your address. In fact, make sure you write once a week, even if it's only a few words. I'll do that. I ain't one for writing, as you know, but for you, I'll make the effort. He stood up, and she did too. He embraced her, knowing that whatever he just said to the contrary, it were likely to be a long time before he saw her again. He wanted a clean break, to start again, and make something of himself. He didn't fancy socializing, so he went upstairs and packed the items he intended to take with him. He heard Betty putting his boys to bed, but didn't go into them. He waited until she came out of the children's room and then called her name. She pushed open the door and saw his bag. I knew it. You're leaving us, aren't you? He was about to explain his reasons, that he would come and visit, that he would write, but she gave him no chance to speak. You never loved me. That blooming dog's come first and Sarah second. Me and the boys are last in your affections. You go. You're no use or ornament to me. I'll be glad to see the back of you, Alfie Nightingale. She turned and stamped out, her nose in the air. Even then, in her fury, she remembered not to slam the door and wake the children. He heard Sarah come up, which meant that his ma would be downstairs on her own. He wanted to get a few things straight with her before he left in the morning. When Sarah went down the next morning, her brother had already gone. The house seemed empty somehow without Buster or Alfie. Come along, Spot. You can't hide under there any longer. You need to go out in the garden and do your business. The dog sidled out on his belly, ignored his full food bowl, but slipped out of the door when she held it open. The 2 kitchen maids were already busy at their duties, so she had a precious half an hour to herself before her daughter woke. She spent the time checking the stock in the sewing room, making note of what was needed for the orders in hand. By the time this was done, the seamstresses had arrived, chattering and laughing as if today was like any other day. For them, of course, the loss of the dog and Alfie would make no difference at all. Breakfast was quieter than usual, but apart from that, it was as if nothing untoward had taken place yesterday. Even her boys were acting as if they didn't care. It would appear that only the remaining dog and herself were affected. Betty was talking brightly about a forthcoming play that was to be performed locally. Her mother didn't eat breakfast and was already overseeing the girls in the workroom. Then her daughter banged on the table with her spoon. Where's my Uncle Alfie and big dog Buster? I don't like it here without them. The words hung in the air. The atmosphere changed. Tommy began to cry, Jimmy joined in, and then Betty began to sob too. Her boys dropped their cutlery, pushed back their chairs with such violence, 2 of them crashed to the flagstones, and they ran out of the back door without their midday snack. Sarah wanted to join in the general wailing and crying, but swallowed the lump in her throat. "Betty, you're upsetting the children. Mary, love, your uncle has gone away for a bit on business, and your big friend Buster has gone to join your pa in heaven." Betty dried her eyes on her sleeve and used the edge of the tablecloth to mop the faces of her boys. "That's right. Your pa will be back to see you soon enough. Buster was old and sick. He's running around like a puppy now with your Uncle Dan." Hearing these platitudes from both Sarah and Betty was enough to stop the racket. Tommy picked up a spoon and continued to eat his porridge. Mary was not so easily placated. She looked around the table and then fixed her eyes on her. "I don't like Buster being with our pa. I want him to come back. I don't want Uncle Alfie to be with pa." "No, sweetheart, he's not in heaven. He's gone to London on business. Now, finish your breakfast, and I'll take you and Tommy for a walk along the river. What about that?" This was enough to distract her daughter. Betty ate nothing. Neither did she. It would be some time before her appetite returned. "Where is Spot, Sarah? I can't see him in the garden." Sure enough, the garden was empty, apart from the chickens in their run at the far end. "He must have gone with the boys. They'll bring him home when they come at lunchtime. I'm sure he'll wait quietly in the yard outside the school until they come out again. I hope you're right, but he's never done that before, and I think one of them would have brought him back." "There's nothing we can do about it now. I've got a meeting this afternoon at a warehouse, so I'd better get off if I'm going to be back in time." With Betty's help, the little ones were soon ready for their walk. When she suggested they go to the river and feed the ducks with stale bread, they were overjoyed at the idea. Once they were safely through the town and away from the diligences, carriages and barrows, she let the children walk without holding her hands. "Ma, can we run?" Mary asked, as she hopped from one foot to the other. "Not by the river, sweetheart, just in case you fall in." Her younger brother, Tommy, had fallen into the River Colne in Colchester and drowned. He'd been a bit older than these two, but it had destroyed the family. Her stepfather had blamed her for not keeping an eye on him, and Alfie had run away. This was 7 years ago, but being by the river with small children brought it painfully to mind. Even letting Tommy and Mary walk sedately in front of her was almost too much. She didn't want to go too far, as she knew how long it would take to feed the ducks and didn't want to be late for her important meeting. Whilst she was out, she intended to call in at the bank and see if Alfie had kept his word. "I can see a lot of ducks on the other side of the river, children, so this will be a good place to throw the bread to them." They were now about a mile from the town. The path was quiet, with only the sound of the birds and the gentle lapping of the river against the bank to break the peace. The children had a small cloth bag each full of crusts. She had brought a piece of old toweling for them to sit on whilst they threw the bread. They would be much safer on their bottoms than dancing around on the edge. Then Mary squealed in excitement. "Look, Ma! I can see Spot up there on the bank. Why is he lying there?" Sarah knew at once. This must be where Buster was buried, but she can hardly tell them this. "Why don't you call him? You know how he loves bread. I think he might come to us if he knows we've got plenty to give him." Mary tugged at her skirt. "He's sad, Ma, 'cause Buster's gone." "I think he is, sweetheart, but we'll just have to be extra nice to him until he gets over it." She positioned herself between the water and the children whilst they jumped up and down and shouted for the dog to come. It was amazing to see the animal respond so rapidly, from dejected to delighted in the space of seconds. "He's coming! He's coming! I want to give him everything. Them old ducks can wait till next time," Tommy yelled. The dog bounded up to them and covered the children in wet, slobbery kisses. He didn't seem too bothered about the bread, was just pleased to see them. They spent a happy hour throwing bread into the river, which was left to sink in a soggy mass, as the ducks had more sense than to come over with the dog there. They threw sticks into the water, and Spot jumped in to retrieve them. "I'm going to dry your hands first, children, and then give the dog a rub down." "Spot's happy again, Auntie Sarah, ain't he?" "He is, Tommy. He had a grand time today." On the way back, the animal walked at her side, pressing close. She hadn't the heart to push him away, even though her gown was soaking by the time they reached the garden gate. What the children hadn't understood was that the dog had somehow scaled the fence. It would no longer be safe to leave him unattended in the garden, which was a nuisance. She really didn't want to have to tie him up. Her mother was tight-lipped about Alfie's departure, and Betty pretended everything was fine and her husband would be home in a day or two. It was true that they could manage perfectly well to run the business without him being there, but a home without a man at its head was somehow incomplete. That afternoon she put on her best bonnet, her smartest gown, and set out to visit the only bank in the town. The small counter behind which stood 2 tellers occupied the far end of the room. It was hardly a grand affair, little more than a branch office. She came in so frequently she was recognised and greeted by name. "I bid you good morning, Mrs. Cooper. How can I be of assistance today?" "I need to speak to Mr. Cricket if he's available. He was one of the directors of this bank and was usually around in the morning." She was ushered with due ceremony into the small office at the rear of the building. Once she was seated, she explained the reason for her visit. "I can confirm, Mrs. Cooper, that Mr. Nightingale deposited 25 guineas in your account yesterday. Do you wish to know the balance?" "I do indeed. That is the main reason I've come in. I've also a deposit for the account of Mrs. Rand and another one for my own account." She was pleased to hear she would have just over £50 with the 2 she was adding today. "Thank you, Mr. Cricket. I shall be depositing in both accounts in future." He knew better than to comment on the change of arrangement. She stood, he did also, and she bid him good day. As long as Ma didn't go into the bank herself and asked to see her balance, she could see no difficulty putting money aside for herself and her family. The silk merchants showed her their latest samples and she made her order. They were now getting not only the less well-off coming in to buy ready-made clothes, but also the more well-to-do. Word had spread that the latest fashions could be purchased from their business at a fraction of the cost of having something made especially to measure. She shuddered as she remembered the appalling garments she had been obliged to wear before her beloved Dan had taken her under his wing. She could no longer recall his voice in her head, but seeing Joe every day kept his face fresh in her memory. She stopped to pass the time of day with 2 acquaintances and was almost at her front door when there were heavy footsteps behind her. Her heart lifted. Alfie had changed his mind and come back to them. She spun and saw not her brother, but Robert Billings, a gentleman almost as dear to her. Robert was more than 2 yards high, handsome in a rugged sort of way, but his most unusual feature was his startlingly red hair. "Sarah, I'm glad I caught you. Must you go in immediately, or can we take a stroll along the river? I need to talk to you in private." "How is it that you always know when you are most needed? I have much to tell you as well. She put her arm through his, and they walked in companionable silence along the edge of the River Cann. We won't be able to walk along here as we do now when the new houses are finished. I hear the sewage is to go directly into the river. It will be most unpleasant, as the river is scarcely wide enough to deal with it. He chuckled. You'll need to keep the dogs out of the water. She swallowed a lump in her throat at his mention of the dogs. Buster died yesterday, and Alfie has gone to live in London. That's not all. I fear my mother does not consider me a true partner in the business, as I've only invested my time and expertise and not hard cash. She had his full attention now. I'm sorry to hear about Buster. He was a grand dog. I'm not surprised Alfie has taken off. He's not been happy here, having nothing valuable to do. I told him he had my support as long as he keeps in touch. I pray he doesn't disappoint me in that respect. Did you tell him your fears about the business and Mrs. Rand? He suggested I put money in my own account each week and not have it all go in my mother's. A wise decision. However, Sarah, you'll never be without support as long as I'm alive. You know how I feel about you. I've waited 2 years to speak, but I'm hoping you'll consider taking me as your husband on my next leave. Sarah had known this question was coming, but until he spoke had not known what her answer would be. I should love to marry you, Robert, but there are conditions to my acceptance. You must take all of us or none. I wish to continue to work. I doubt I would be content as a lady of leisure. His roar of triumph sent hopeful ducks quacking into the air in disapproval. He grabbed her elbows and swung her around as if she weighed no more than a bag of feathers. Robert, put me down! I'm not a child! Instead of doing so, he pulled her hard against his broad chest, his intentions clear. She wasn't sure she was ready to be kissed by him, but he left her no option. He tilted her face up and covered her mouth with his. She had expected to feel the pleasant warmth she had always experienced when Dan had done the same. To her astonishment, heat travelled from her toes to her crown and centred in her most private place. She leant against him, willingly opened her mouth, and sailed into uncharted territories. Finally, she understood what Betty had said years ago when they had discussed the intimacies of marriage. Her friend had insisted if there weren't tingles up and down her arms, she wasn't doing it correctly. Kissing Robert was sending shockwaves throughout her body. The sooner she could share his bed, the better. Chapter 3. London, 1848. Alfie had no regrets about departing. As far as he was concerned, they would all be better off without him. He was just an extra mouth.